Before sunrise, the street was already awake. Not with movement, but with bodies. They stood close to the wall, spaced just enough to breathe, facing the same direction. No one asked how long it would take. Everyone already knew. The ground was cool beneath their feet. Stone held the night longer than the air. Some leaned against it, shifting weight from one leg to the other, saving strength without thinking about it. Others sat on folded cloth or sacks meant for carrying grain later in the morning. This was not urgency. It was sequence. The line existed because it always did. On these days, it formed naturally, without signal or instruction. People arrived at different times, but the order was understood. Faces were familiar without being named. No greetings were required. Containers waited empty. Baskets, sacks, pieces of cloth tied carefully at the corners. Each one measured against the body that would carry it away. As the light changed, the city adjusted around the line. Doors opened behind it. Footsteps passed in front of it. The morning continued, and the line remained part of it, neither obstacle nor event. When distribution began, it did so quietly. Measures were taken, numbers recorded. Grain moved from storage to hand with minimal contact. The texture was familiar, dry, rough, unchanged from the last time. No explanation followed its transfer. What happened next was not the concern of those who handed it over. Waiting occupied more time than receiving. People shifted forward in small increments. A few steps, then stillness. Conversations occurred briefly and ended on their own. Most attention stayed on posture, balance, and the gradual movement of the line. When the grain was finally received, it felt heavier than expected and lighter than hoped. It always did. The container was adjusted against the body, the weight tested, then accepted. From there, the paths diverged. Some carried the grain home, others toward mills or shared spaces. A few would trade part of it for prepared food before the day fully began. The grain itself did not determine the choice. Circumstance did. What mattered was that the first measure had been taken. The day could now proceed. The line formed before sunrise, not because food was scarce that day, but because it always required waiting. Bodies arranged themselves into order with little discussion, each person already aware of the pace the morning would take. Distribution days followed a fixed rhythm. Notices were known in advance, locations unchanged. The movement toward them began early, shaped by habit rather than urgency. People arrived carrying sacks, baskets, or folded cloths meant to be filled. The containers were practical, repaired often, and sized to the portion expected. No one brought more than could be carried away without effort. The grain distribution was an administrative act. It did not resemble charity or ceremony. Officials measured, recorded, and moved on. The grain itself was ordinary, clean enough, dry, unremarkable. It was handed over without instruction. Its future form depended on the recipient's tools, fuel, and time. Waiting occupied most of the experience. Lines advanced slowly, interrupted by verification, disputes over eligibility, or temporary shortages at a given station. These delays were familiar. People adjusted their posture, shifted weight, and rested when possible. Conversations occurred, but quietly. The focus remained forward, on the measure yet to be received. Those who depended on daily labor calculated the cost of waiting. Time spent in line was time not spent earning. Some arrived early to finish quickly. Others came later, accepting longer waits in exchange for morning work. These decisions were individual but predictable, repeated month after month. Once collected, the grain became a private responsibility. It was carried home or to a shared space, sometimes entrusted to a neighbor for grinding. Mills were small, often communal, and charged by volume. The sound of stone against stone was constant in certain streets, a background rhythm tied directly to eating. Grinding required effort and attention. Grain reduced too coarsely produced rough porridge. Ground too finely, it wasted energy and time. Experience guided the hand. Children assisted, learning by repetition. Flour dust settled on skin and clothing, unnoticed. Cooking followed. Fuel determined frequency. Charcoal or wood was expensive and used sparingly. Many households cooked once per day, preparing enough to last until evening. Grain boiled slowly, stirred to prevent sticking, washed but not constantly. The result was consistent, thick, pale, filling. Bread required additional steps and access to heat. Some neighborhoods relied on communal ovens, used in shifts. Dough was marked or shaped distinctively to ensure return to its owner. The process demanded coordination and patience. Missed turns meant longer waits, altered plans, or eating something else. Taverns absorbed much of this complexity. For a small payment, one could bypass grinding, fuel, and supervision. The food offered reflected what could be produced in bulk with minimal waste. Grain stews dominated, occasionally enriched with legumes or vegetables. The pot determined the menu. These establishments operated continuously. Their doors remained open through much of the day, serving those who worked irregular hours or lacked cooking space. The environment was functional. Surfaces were worn smooth by use. Utensils were reused without comment. Cleanliness was maintained to the extent required to continue operation. Meals eaten in taverns were brief. Standing or leaning, customers consumed quickly and left. There was little conversation beyond transactions. Regulars were acknowledged but not indulged. The goal was turnover, not comfort. Foodborne illness was accepted as part of this system. Stomach pain, weakness, and sudden fatigue followed certain meals, certain days. People noticed patterns, but lacked alternatives. Avoidance was selective and temporary. Hunger outweighed caution. Water used in cooking came from nearby sources. Its quality varied. Some water tasted metallic, others flat. Boiling reduced visible impurities, but did not guarantee safety. These distinctions were not framed as health concerns, but as preferences, noted and ignored as necessary. Children ate what adults ate, in smaller portions. Their growth reflected the diet's limits, steady but modest. Illness affected them frequently, though recovery was expected. Mortality was understood statistically rather than personally, part of the city's constant turnover. The evening meal marked a pause rather than an end. Grain prepared earlier was reheated or eaten cold. Additions, if any, were incorporated then. A small piece of cheese, a few olives, a scrap of fish. These transformed texture and pace more than nutrition. Eating slowed, becoming the day's longest meal. Afterward, hunger receded but did not disappear. The body adjusted, settling into a neutral state that lasted until sleep. Night passed without eating. Morning returned the familiar pressure. The system endured because it was predictable. Distribution, preparation, consumption, each followed known steps. Disruptions caused frustration, not alarm. People complained about measurement errors, late deliveries, or rising costs, but the underlying structure remained intact. In this way, grain was not merely food but schedule. It organized movement, labor, and rest. The body learned its intervals. Hunger became a signal of time passing, not of crisis approaching. By the end of the day, the grain received in the morning had already begun to diminish. Its absence was anticipated. Tomorrow would repeat the process, with slight variations that changed nothing essential. The line would form again, and waiting would resume. By mid-morning, The smell of cooked grain drifted through certain streets, faint but recognizable. It did not signal abundance, only that someone nearby had access to heat. Taverns and food stalls occupied the lower edges of buildings, opening directly onto the street. Their counters faced outward, blurring the boundary between interior and public space. These were not places of retreat. They were points of exchange, positioned where movement was constant and pauses were brief. The food they offered was visible before it was tasted. Large pots rested over low fires, their contents stirred intermittently to prevent burning. The mixture inside changed slowly across the day, adjusted as ingredients were added or removed. Grain formed the base. Everything else was subordinate. These hot pots were designed for efficiency rather than flavor. A single preparation could serve dozens, sometimes hundreds, with minimal attention. Water, grain, and whatever vegetables were available were combined early and left to thicken. Toward evening, scraps of meat or fish might be introduced, often already preserved or dried, extending their presence without altering the structure of the dish. Customers approached the counter individually or in pairs. Payment was made in small denominations. Portions were ladled without measurement, judged by experience and the need to conserve. The vessel used, bowl, cup, or scrap of pottery, was returned or replaced as needed. Cleanliness was implied by continuity. If people kept coming back, it was considered sufficient. Eating occurred on the spot. There were few places to sit, and none were designed for long stays. People leaned against walls or stood just beyond the counter, consuming quickly before returning to work. The heat of the food mattered more than its taste, especially in cooler months. Taverns functioned as extensions of the household for those without cooking facilities. Regulars knew the rhythm of each place, when the pot was freshest, when it thinned, when it was best avoided. This knowledge circulated informally, passed through observation rather than instruction. Illness followed these patterns without disrupting them. A meal that caused discomfort one day might be eaten again the next if hunger required it. The body's reactions were noted but rarely discussed. Weakness, nausea, and pain were absorbed into daily calculation, weighed against effort and cost. The repetition of tavern food shaped expectations. People did not seek variety, they sought reliability. A dish that changed too often inspired suspicion. Consistency suggested stability, even if the outcome was bland or heavy. Children were sent to collect food for households, carrying portions carefully to avoid spillage. They learned early how to navigate crowds and negotiate space at the counter. The food they brought back was shared without ceremony. The role of alcohol intersected with food but did not replace it. Diluted wine was consumed alongside meals, both for taste and as a substitute for water. It carried calories and familiarity. Its effects were mild, integrated into work rather than separate from it. As afternoon progressed, the pots grew thinner. Water was added to extend supply. The texture changed, becoming less substantial but still filling. Customers noticed but adjusted, sometimes requesting slightly larger portions, sometimes accepting less. Evening brought a brief intensification. Workers returned, hunger renewed. Taverns filled quickly, then emptied just as fast. The day's remaining food was sold or consumed by those who worked there. Nothing was saved beyond what could be safely reused. The physical environment reflected this cycle. Floors were worn smooth, counters stained. Smoke darkened walls over time. These signs were not associated with neglect, but with use. Repair occurred when necessary, not before. In this setting, food was not separate from labor or space. It was embedded in movement, transactions, and routine. Taverns did not offer escape from deprivation. They managed it efficiently. By nightfall, the fires were reduced. Pots were emptied or covered. The smell faded. Hunger, briefly quieted, began its return. The city continued to move around these spaces, already preparing for their reopening the next day. Nothing about this cycle was remarkable to those who lived within it. The hot pot was not a feature of hardship, but a fixture of the street. It provided what was needed and no more, repeating itself without variation day after day. Bread was not eaten for pleasure. It was handled, broken, and consumed with the same neutrality as any other tool required for the day. Most loaves produced for the lower population shared a common appearance. They were round or flat, dense, and darkened by coarse flour. The grain had been milled unevenly, leaving fragments that resisted complete softening. When fresh, the bread yielded slightly. When old, it required effort. This bread was not expected to last long. It dried quickly in the open air of crowded rooms. Households planned its use accordingly, eating newer loaves first and reserving older ones for soaking or crumbling into broth. Waste was rare, not by principle but by habit. Baking was an occasional task rather than a daily one. The cost of fuel and access to ovens shaped frequency. Some families baked weekly, others less often, depending on work schedules and resources. Dough was prepared in advance, shaped simply, and marked to identify ownership before being taken to communal ovens. The ovens themselves operated on strict routines. Time was divided among users, and delays were common. Heat was uneven, producing loaves that varied slightly in texture and color. These differences were accepted. A burnt edge or pale center did not diminish the bread's purpose. Purchased bread followed similar patterns. Bakeries produced in quantity, aiming for consistency rather than refinement. Prices fluctuated with grain supply and regulation. People noticed changes in weight more than in taste. A lighter loaf attracted complaint. A heavier one passed without remark. Bread accompanied nearly every meal. It was eaten alone, dipped into stews, or used to collect remaining liquid from bowls. It required no preparation and could be carried easily, making it suitable for workdays spent away from home. Illness influenced how bread was consumed, but not whether it was. Digestive discomfort made softer preparations preferable. Bread was soaked or broken apart for those weakened by sickness. The adjustments were practical, not medical. Children learned to eat bread slowly, conserving it. Crumbs were gathered and reused. Nothing about this process was instructional. It was absorbed through observation. The monotony of bread was not commented upon. It did not inspire dissatisfaction. It simply existed, forming the background of meals. Other foods were noted when present. Bread was assumed. Even when alternatives appeared, fruit in season, vegetables from small markets, bread remained central. These additions were eaten alongside it, not in place of it. Bread defined the meal structure. At night, pieces of bread were set aside for morning. Their presence provided reassurance rather than comfort. Hunger could be postponed if bread was available. Its absence was noticed more than its taste. Bread also functioned socially. It could be shared without ceremony. Breaking a loaf required no explanation. It was understood as a neutral act, neither generous nor stingy. By the end of the day, the bread supply diminished. What remained was planned for. What was gone would be replaced through grain, purchase, or waiting. In this way, bread maintained continuity. It did not elevate meals or mark occasions. It sustained routine. Its sameness allowed attention to shift elsewhere, to work, movement, and rest. Bread without distinction suited the city. It asked nothing and promised nothing beyond persistence. Occasionally, Something appeared beside the grain that altered the meal without changing its nature. These additions were modest, often brief, and never assumed. Vegetables entered the diet according to season and proximity. Leafy greens, onions, and leeks were common enough, though rarely abundant. They were purchased in small quantities, carried home, and cooked quickly to conserve fuel. Their presence softened the grain but did not replace it. Legumes were more substantial. Beans and lentils offered density and variety, but their preparation required time and heat. As a result, they appeared when conditions allowed. When they did, they were stretched across multiple meals, diluted rather than consumed whole. Fruit was eaten fresh when available, often between meals rather than as part of them. Its sweetness was noticed but not emphasized. Overripe fruit was common, its condition accepted. Preservation was limited, and spoilage was expected. Animal products entered the diet irregularly. Cheese appeared in small pieces, valued for its keeping quality. It was eaten sparingly, shaved or crumbled to extend its presence. Eggs were occasional, consumed simply. Meat was rare and usually shared, its quantity insufficient to alter overall intake. Fish, especially preserved fish, was more accessible. Salted varieties were broken apart and mixed into grain or stews. Their strong flavor allowed small amounts to influence an entire dish. Fresh fish was consumed near markets or waterways, dependent on timing and cost. Oil was used carefully. A small amount changed texture and eased swallowing. It was added at the end of cooking or dripped onto bread. Its absence was noted. Its presence was appreciated without comment. These additions were not planned in advance. They were acquired when circumstances allowed and integrated into existing routines. Meals adjusted to include them without ceremony. Illness influenced choices subtly. Certain foods were avoided during periods of discomfort, though not permanently. The relationship between diet and health was observed pragmatically, without systematization. Children learned to recognize these additions as temporary. They did not expect repetition. A meal with cheese or fish was enjoyed but not anticipated. The presence of additions slowed eating. They required attention, small adjustments in pace. Their absence returned meals to efficiency. In taverns, additions depended on the day's supply. A pot might contain more vegetables one day, fewer the next. Regulars noticed but adapted. These variations introduced minor uncertainty into an otherwise stable pattern. They did not disrupt routine but provided brief contrast. By nightfall, additions were gone. Grain remained. The day's variation concluded without residue. In this way, small additions punctuated sameness without challenging it. They altered texture and taste temporarily, then disappeared, leaving the structure intact. Discomfort did not interrupt the day. It accompanied it, moving quietly alongside work, eating, and rest. The effects of diet appeared gradually and without emphasis. Weakness, bloating, and recurring pain were common enough to form expectations. People learned what their bodies could tolerate and when to pause. These calculations were practical, not reflective. Meals were eaten despite symptoms. Hunger outweighed caution, and familiarity reduced concern. A food that caused discomfort one day might be eaten again the next if nothing else was available. The body adapted by narrowing its responses, conserving energy rather than resisting. Illness was understood as fluctuation rather than event. Periods of strength alternated with periods of fatigue. Recovery was assumed unless proven otherwise. Medical intervention was rare and reserved for severe cases. Most conditions were managed through rest, reduced intake, or substitution when possible. Water contributed to these patterns. Its source mattered less than its availability. Public fountains provided steady supply, but storage altered quality. Water sat in vessels, absorbed residue, and was reused. Boiling occurred incidentally through cooking, not as precaution. Children experienced illness frequently, though it rarely prompted alarm. Growth continued unevenly, shaped by intake and recovery. The boundary between health and sickness was fluid, crossed often and without notice. Work accommodated these conditions informally. Tasks were adjusted, pauses taken when necessary. Absence due to illness was accepted within limits, though it carried cost. People returned to work as soon as function allowed, not when strength was fully restored. Food choices during illness shifted slightly. Softer preparations were preferred. Grain was thinned, bread soaked. These adjustments reduced strain without altering supply. Once symptoms eased, routines resumed. Taverns observed these patterns indirectly. Customers altered orders or quantities without explanation. The pot remained the same. Consumption adapted around it. There was no expectation of comfort from food. It was not used to heal, but to sustain. The body's response was monitored, but not interpreted. Pain did not demand meaning. It required endurance. Night offered partial relief. Rest reduced awareness of discomfort, though it did not eliminate it. Morning returned both hunger and whatever remained of the body's condition. The two were addressed together, without distinction. In this environment, health was measured by capacity to continue. Illness became part of routine rather than exception. Food supported this continuity imperfectly, but consistently. The body adjusted because it had to. It learned the limits imposed by repetition and scarcity and operated within them, day after day, without expectation of change. Meals rarely occurred in isolation. Even when eaten alone, they were surrounded by the presence of others, sounds through walls, movement in shared spaces, the awareness of parallel routines unfolding nearby. In crowded dwellings, eating took place wherever space allowed. A corner of a room, a step near the entrance, a shared landing between floors. Food was balanced on the knee or held close to the body. There were few surfaces reserved solely for eating, and none protected from interruption. Shared meals were common but informal. People ate together because they lived together, not because the occasion required it. Portions were not ceremonially divided. Each person consumed what was available, adjusting instinctively to the number present. Conversation during meals was minimal. Eating served a function, and speech slowed it. When words were exchanged, they concerned work, timing, or the next task. Food itself was rarely discussed unless something was missing or unexpectedly present. Children ate alongside adults, observing without instruction. They learned when to eat quickly and when to slow down, when to ask and when to wait. These lessons were absorbed through repetition rather than correction. In taverns, eating occurred among strangers. Proximity replaced familiarity. People stood shoulder to shoulder, focused on their bowls. Interaction was limited to brief acknowledgments or practical negotiation of space. The shared act did not imply connection. Food reinforced hierarchy quietly. Those with steadier income ate more regularly, though not differently. Those without adjusted their presence, arriving later or ordering less. These distinctions were visible but not remarked upon. Illness affected group eating subtly. A weakened person ate less, received softer portions, or was allowed more time. These accommodations were made without explanation, understood by those present. Leftovers, when they existed, were shared or saved according to proximity and need. Ownership was flexible within small groups. The goal was use, not control. As daylight faded, shared meals marked a slowing of movement. People gathered briefly, ate, and dispersed to sleep. The act closed the day without ceremony. Eating in company did not transform the food, but it shaped its rhythm. It introduced pauses, adjustments, and quiet coordination. Through these shared moments, routine was maintained. Food passed from hand to mouth, from pot to bowl, from day to day. In company or alone, it served the same purpose: to allow life to continue without interruption. Fullness was temporary and precisely judged. It did not linger, and it was never complete. People learned early what enough felt like. It was not satisfaction, but a threshold, the point at which movement could continue without strain. Eating stopped there, either because the body signaled it or because the portion ended. The distinction mattered little. Meals were portioned by circumstance rather than appetite. What was available determined how much was eaten. Surplus was rare and managed cautiously. Extra food was not consumed immediately, but saved, redistributed, or diluted to extend its reach. Grain provided volume more than energy. It filled the stomach quickly, producing a sense of weight that quieted hunger. This effect faded predictably. People understood its duration and planned accordingly, spacing work and rest around it. Bread offered a different measure. Its density allowed smaller quantities to feel sufficient. A piece carried in the hand could postpone hunger for hours. It was eaten slowly when possible, broken into smaller portions to extend the pause it provided. Tavern portions reflected similar calculations. Bowls were filled to a level that balanced cost and effect. Regular customers recognized when a serving was lighter than usual, but response was muted. A nod, a glance, a return another day. Children learned these measures without explanation. They knew when to stop eating to ensure food remained for later. Hunger taught restraint more effectively than instruction. Illness altered the sense of enough. During weakness, smaller amounts sufficed. The body signaled limits earlier, and they were respected. Recovery restored previous measures gradually, without conscious adjustment. There was no pursuit of excess. Overeating caused discomfort without benefit. The diet did not encourage indulgence, and the body did not expect it. Eating beyond enough was inefficient. Enough also shaped distribution within households. Portions were adjusted subtly according to age, labor, and condition. These adjustments were made without comment, guided by familiarity rather than fairness. By evening, enough had been reached and passed earlier in the day. Hunger returned, but the work was done. What remained was accepted. This understanding of enough stabilized routine. It aligned intake with necessity, allowing food to serve its purpose without distraction. The body adapted to this precision, functioning within narrow margins. Enough was not abundance. It was adequacy, measured daily and recalibrated constantly. Within its limits, life continued, quietly and predictably. Most days passed without distinction. They were marked by repetition rather than memory, their details blending into one another without resistance. Food contributed to this indistinction. Meals followed the same sequence, at the same times, in the same forms. Variations were too small to separate one day from the next. A different pot at a tavern, a slightly heavier loaf, a missed addition, these were noticed briefly, then absorbed. Hunger appeared on schedule. It did not surprise or interrupt. It arrived as expected, settled into the body, and waited. Eating responded to it, not completely, but sufficiently. The cycle closed and reopened without emphasis. Work filled the space between meals. Food supported it indirectly, allowing movement, endurance, and attention. Its absence would have been disruptive. Its presence was neutral. This balance maintained the day's shape. Illness, when present, blurred time further. Fatigue shortened days, slowed movement, and reduced intake. Recovery was gradual and unremarkable. No clear boundary separated sick days from healthy ones. The body adjusted pace rather than stopping. Markets, taverns, and ovens operated regardless of individual condition. Their schedules continued, providing continuity even as personal experience varied. Participation depended on capacity, not readiness. Children experienced this repetition most fully. Days were differentiated by activity rather than meals. Food remained constant, forming a stable background against which growth occurred. Memory attached itself elsewhere. There were no rituals to mark eating beyond necessity. Meals did not open or close days symbolically. They occurred when required and ended when possible. Over time, this pattern produced familiarity rather than fatigue. The predictability reduced anxiety. Knowing what would be eaten, how it would feel, and how long it would last allowed attention to remain on other concerns. Food did not demand reflection. It did not inspire dissatisfaction or longing. It fulfilled its role quietly, enabling days to pass without notice. In this way, deprivation was not experienced as loss. It was simply the absence of alternatives. Routine filled the space where expectation might otherwise form. Days accumulated without distinction, supported by the same meals, the same measures, the same adjustments. Life progressed not through change, but through continuity. Nothing about the food was meant to endure beyond the day. It sustained, then disappeared, leaving little trace. What remained was not flavor or memory, but pattern. The repeated handling of grain, the steady return of hunger, the familiar weight of bread in the hand. These shaped the body and the day more reliably than any single meal. Over time, they formed expectation without promise. The diet did not improve or decline in any meaningful sense. It adjusted slightly with season, supply, and circumstance, but its structure held. Grain remained central. Additions appeared and vanished. Taverns opened and closed their pots. Distribution continued at measured intervals. Illness persisted at a low, constant level. It neither dominated nor receded. The body learned to function within it, distinguishing only between what could be endured and what required pause. Food supported this balance imperfectly, but consistently. Children grew into adults without marking the transition in how they ate. Portions increased gradually. Hunger followed the same rhythm. The continuity of diet blurred generational difference, linking one stage of life to the next through repetition rather than change. No broader meaning was attached to these conditions. Eating was not framed as struggle or virtue. It was not used to define identity. It existed alongside work, shelter, and movement as one of several necessary processes. The city absorbed these routines. Its streets accommodated the flow to taverns and ovens. Its administration measured grain without commentary. Its population moved in step with food availability, adjusting pace rather than direction. In this environment, endurance did not require resilience as a concept. It required familiarity. Knowing what would come next reduced uncertainty. Hunger, managed daily, lost its urgency. What remained at the end of each day was readiness for the next. Containers were emptied, tools set aside, bodies rested. Morning would return the same conditions, and they would be met again without surprise. Food among the lower classes of Rome did not tell a story of scarcity or abundance. It described continuity. Through repetition, limitation became structure, and structure allowed life to proceed quietly from one day to another.